Good evening, everyone. My name is Madeline Serna Marmol. I'm the Associate Superintendent for APS, for Equity, Instruction, Innovation, and Support, and we're so happy to have you here this evening for our Wellness Fair. And I would make sure that you get plenty to eat. We have sandwiches and chips and water. And then after this session, you'll be able to go out and see some of our community partners. But I would like to present our superintendent, Raquel Reedy, who will give our welcome. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see you. Es un gran placer estar aquí con ustedes. I really am thrilled that you're here. People are going to be trickling in. The sandwiches are good. I checked them out. So I think you're going to have a wonderful experience this evening. One of the things that you can see, this is the very aptly named Bonifacio Professional Development Building for teachers and educators. And I was just looking at this and I was thinking, you know, this would be a really nice place for our high school students to have their prom. So there's like a little tables and some trees, and it's kind of nice, and then they can dance here, and then they can go out and chit and chat, and I just think there's so many opportunities, not only for the staff, but for our community and for our students with this wonderful building. And I just need to tell you, not all of you may not be aware of who Bonifacio was, but she was one of our board members, a true educator. She gave her life to her career and her family, and again, it was very heartwarming when the decision was made to name this building after this very special and important person in the life of APS. So the purpose of this event is to provide you with information and resources about student mental health and wellness. It is something that we as adults, we went through high school and middle school and the angst that goes with it. Well, let me tell you, today's youth are facing some incredible experiences that we never even dreamt of. Society today is so different, and the stresses on our students, if anything, has probably quadrupled. And it's just not right. I want to emphasize that student mental health and wellness is not simply just a family issue. It is not simply just a school issue. It is a community issue. It is all of us that need to come together to support and give the students the foundation that they need in order to succeed in life beyond school, to have the skills to be good, productive adults, and to be able to make the right decisions. And as I said before, it is just a very difficult time for our youth, so it's very timely that we have a gathering like this, because there are some wonderful opportunities, some resources that perhaps you may not be aware of, and we would love for you to go and visit and make sure that you know what is out there. Maybe not for today, but maybe sometime in the future, or for your neighbors, or for your nephews and nieces, for the family. It is something that you really want to arm yourself with, because again, like I said, you just never know when this kind of concern will arise in any family. Tonight we're going to have some fantastic breakout sessions with topics ranging from behavioral health to substance abuse to cyberbullying, and the role that our school counselors take to support the well-being of our children and to support the families as they watch their children grow. It's my hope that after tonight you will leave with the tools that have those important mental health conversations with your child and with the experts that are out here waiting for us, and know how to get the help if your child is struggling with anything. That's why we're here. We're here to support your family I invite you to visit our community partners in between sessions and to get resources and information to support your children and families. So at this time, what I would like to do is to introduce Renee Martinez with Southwest Family Guidance to give the keynote address entitled Connection is Everything, What 15 Years of Youth Suicide Assessments Have Taught Us. A very difficult topic, but I thank you for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And it's funny because my last name is actually LaVale now, but I was Martinez for the majority of my career, so even I still introduce myself as Martinez, so it works just fine for me. I answer to both. I am the clinical director of the Southwest Family Guidance Center, and Southwest Family Guidance Center is an organization that has been working with APS for 15 years, specifically regarding suicide and crisis assessments. I have been there for about 12 of those and have worked in the suicide assessment program for the entirety of that 12 years in one capacity or another. Southwest Family Guidance Center is actually in a really unique program with APS, and I don't know how many people are aware of this. Actually, before I go too far, how many parents are in the room right now? Oh, good, lots of parents. How many just APS faculty and staff? And students? Great, thank you. Just gives me some perspective on who I'm talking to. APS actually created this relationship with outside providers, and what our relationship actually is APS pays for a provider to be available to provide same-day suicide assessments for any kiddo in APS who has reported any sort of ideation of any variety. So written, said something on social media, told a friend, anything about wanting to die. APS has set up this program where on those days, on those situations, where those kiddos can go to the counselor's office and the parents are offered the opportunity to bring their child into Southwest Family Guidance Center to get a same-day suicide assessment with a clinician, which is, again, an amazing opportunity that we actually talked about before I did this presentation. We just weren't sure that all the parents were even aware that this is something that's available to you and to your child in the schools. In order to give you some perspective on what we're doing, I'm going to walk you through three students. And these are not real names, not real students. They are basically an intersection of all the different types of things that we hear from kids who come in for suicide assessments, and why we end up rating them the way we rate them. So this is Talia. Talia actually told her friend at school that she was just really tired of her life. I'm going to try and sneak around here. And was thinking about dying. So she tells her friends are worried about her, so they actually go to the counselor. The counselor calls her into her office, and they call the mom. Mom comes in, and they elect to come in for the assessment. One of the things that we look for in assessments are the vulnerabilities that are in place with these students, as well as the protective factors or strengths that are in place for them. So in this case, Talia recently moved out of her neighborhood. They moved out of their house into a smaller apartment, so she had to leave her home, her neighborhood, and her school district, which is a significant change for her. She had a death of a relative recently. In this case, it was her grandparent, and it was almost a year ago, but it still is really impacting the family because that grandparent was really important and part of their world. Her grades have been going down for a few years, and as we're assessing her, we oftentimes walk them through scales around, on a scale of 1 to 10, how sad do you feel every day? On a scale of 1 to 10, how anxious, how impulsive, how out of control do you feel? And this kiddo reported that she was feeling some sadness and anxiety. However, she also reported with her mom in the room that she is amazingly close to her family, not just her parents, but her family in general. So she has these really strong family ties. She's in dance, she's in sports, so she has extracurricular activities, pro-social activities where she's connected to friends, she has a group of people that she trusts that she can talk to. She's never thought about suicide before. She's never had any self-harming gestures. This was just something that happened to her right then in that moment as she was thinking about things. And she has a real clear sense of who she wants to be in the future. And future-focused thinking is something that we really look for in adolescents. If they can see themselves at a fixed point in the future, that sense of they can see themselves past this moment, we take that into consideration. So Talia, in this case, was rated low. And our recommendations for her were interesting because mom and kiddo had talked about counseling before, and they both really were excited that she could talk to a counselor to kind of help her think about things. And she reported that she hadn't been to the doctor in a while. She'd been for physicals for sports, but hadn't had any blood work done. She had started her period, so puberty was in play. So there was a lot of things happening in her body that were kind of making it difficult to her. And mom was in the room actively making calls and plans, like, nope, this isn't happening. I'm going to keep my girl safe. So Liam came in because he posted on his social media account, I don't know which one he used because there's a million of them now, and every time I reference one, I get a look from the students that are like, that was yesterday. We don't even use that anymore. So whatever social media he posted it on, but he had recently broken up with his girlfriend, and he posted on social media that he was going to kill himself. He didn't post that he just wanted to die. He posted that he intended to kill himself. Somebody reported it to the school counselor. They called him in. He admitted that he actually was thinking about that last night. They called mom. Mom came in and agreed to come in for the assessment. In the assessment, the kiddo did ask, I'm going to say kiddo a lot, your student asked if mom could step out. And what he reported to us was that he was having some questions about his sexuality, and he thinks that's why his girlfriend broke up with him, because she was the only person that he had shared that there might be some bisexual tendencies in play, and she broke up with him. And this was huge for him because this is his first opportunity to sort of be vulnerable about this, and there was the breakup. He reports that he was feeling bullied, but in this case it's interesting because there is nothing that actually, there was no activities that were happening that showed he was being bullied. He had a perception that his girlfriend told other people what was going on, so he was seeing in other people that they were looking at him differently. He wasn't really able to identify whether there was fact in this or whether it was just how he was feeling because he was feeling so vulnerable. But in addition to these vulnerabilities, he actually had a relative who died by suicide, who had killed themselves. There was a lot of conflict in the family and at his home, and his grades have been dropping for a few years. On the protective factor side, this kiddo is active in sports. He does play soccer and he is in band. His mother is in the room. You can tell that she's distressed by what's happening, but she also had to leave work. She's a little concerned about what's happening, but she's also a little distracted because the truth is, in order for you to bring your kids to the suicide assessment, oftentimes you have to leave work, come get them, and take them to the assessment. And when there's other issues in play, if you have to work your job, you have to pay your bills, there's a lot of stress that comes from that as well. But this kiddo also reported when we asked him, and this is a question we often asked, when you said what you said, is it that you wanted to die, or is it that you wanted things to feel better? And he said, I just wanted things to feel better. I didn't think about dying. In that moment, he was thinking about it. So because we have this really supportive mom who is really on top of what's happening, and he's reporting that he actually doesn't want to die, he just wants his life to feel better, his rating is a medium. And in this case, mom and kiddo are also very open to him beginning to talk to somebody. He's going to go to the doctor. Again, it's something that we recommend pretty frequently in the adolescent age when we're doing the suicide assessments, because there's a lot happening in the brain and the body of an adolescent, and sometimes we just need to go get it checked out just to make sure that there isn't something happening in your body that's making it harder to cope with what is already hard just by virtue of being in elementary, middle school, and high school. This mom also said that she was going to call her sister who lived in town and ask the sister if she could come stay at the house for a few weeks so that he would not be alone at the house. So this was this really proactive situation. Jose is a completely different story. So Jose actually was overheard by his teacher in class talking about just wishing he was dead, just wishing everything was done. She had noticed in some of his earlier writings that he was writing about some darker and darker themes, and overheard this happening in the classroom and went to the counselor and had him brought in. When the counselor asked him if he had in fact been thinking about suicide, he said yes. He said, I just wish I was dead. Everything is really hard right now. Mom did come in, and they did come in for a suicide assessment. So his vulnerabilities are really high. So this is a single mom. She's working multiple jobs, and she has 3 younger children. And I don't think I put this up here, but one of the things that this kiddo does is takes care of his brothers and sisters. So he doesn't mind taking care of his brothers and sisters, but he is essentially the other caregiver for his younger siblings. He's not in sports, he's not in clubs. He wakes up, his mom is asleep, he gets his kids ready, or his siblings ready for school, gets them sent off, goes to school and comes back. He is amazingly hopeless. He can't see anything beyond just surviving the day that he's in right then. He doesn't have a sense of his future. He can't tell you what he wants to do when he grows up. He can't even remember what he used to want to do when he grows up. That is where he is at in that moment. He has very few friends. There is poverty in the home, and that's not a huge predictor, but in addition to everything else that we're talking about, it is a factor. His one positive is that he really loves his brothers and sister. And he says that the reason, when we ask him, you've thought about suicide before, you said you've been thinking about it for a while, why are you still alive? Why are you still here? And he says it's because of his siblings, because he doesn't want to leave them and he doesn't want to have them experience losing him. But even with that protective factor in place, he's obviously high. So, I'm sorry, domestic violence. I'm sorry. I missed that. Thank you for saying that. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but domestic violence is actually a significant risk factor for a lot of things. And it's not actual abuse, it's exposure to domestic violence. It's having been around a situation where you have watched somebody that you love be in a violent situation. Again, in this situation, he's obviously high, but at this time we also have to make the determination whether he is high but safe to go home with a caregiver that can keep him safe, or if he's high imminent, which means he might not be able to, or his system might not be able to keep him safe right now, and we're recommending that they go to the hospital. In this particular case, we did end up sending him to the hospital, and it was a lot to do with just the state that the mom was in that moment. She was really concerned about there was nobody to pick up her other children from school. She had to figure that out. She felt like she could keep him safe in that moment. And oftentimes we will see in those rooms those kiddos making eye contact with us, basically saying, it's not true. So mom is saying what she's saying. We've been in the room with that kiddo, and we have to make that determination at that point whether or not we're recommending that they go to the hospital, which is tough, especially for that mom, because I just made her entire evening even that much harder. But in that moment, that's not what I was there for. I was there to make sure that that kiddo could stay alive at least one more day. So I'm going to trust Google with this, because I was going to call my contacts with APS, and I felt really bad that I didn't. But it roughly says that there's about 80,000 kids in APS, so I'm seeing some nods. Okay, good. And I thought that number was important for us to see, just so that we can talk about perspectives. So the data that I'm talking about today is actually the 2018 and 2019 school year, because I had a full data set for that versus what we're doing right now. From the report of APS, there was 1,400 kiddos who were brought to a counselor for having reported some sort of suicidal ideation or thoughts of suicide or thoughts of wanting to die. Of those 1,400, 948 of them came to Southwest Family to get assessed. And the reason there's a difference in that number isn't a huge negative necessarily, because some kiddos already have therapists or their families have significant resources. So they came in, heard what was said, took it seriously, and then hooked up their children with whatever resources they already had in place. In some cases, the kids go instantly to the hospital and they don't come in for the assessment. And in some cases, the family or the caregiver declines to come in for the assessment. And in some ways, that might feel like a real negative statement, but it's not always a negative statement. It is your right to say this is a voluntary thing that's offered by APS, whether or not you want to come in. But of those 948 that were referred, this is how the data broke out for the 2018-2019 school year. And as you can see, more than half of them were rated high or high imminent. The low risk is an interesting one because they're low for suicide, but we like to qualify with people that we oftentimes get. The suicide assessments that we do are from kindergarten all the way up. And it's not uncommon for a kid, a young kid, a little, to be really distressed in school and to say something about death or wanting to die, and they come in for the suicide assessment, and they really don't have a concept really of what suicide is in that space, but they're still in crisis. So in these cases, oftentimes they were low for suicide risk, but there may have been other factors in place, and then we're always grateful to have had that opportunity to get in front of that parent and come up with some plans, to give them some recommendations, to help them think about how to help their kiddo when they're in that high stress space. Some common risk factors that we look for, there is a myriad of risk factors, but when it comes to adolescents, there's some top risk factors that we look for, and I mentioned some of them in the descriptions of the 3 kiddos, but these are also hopelessness is huge. If you have a child who just cannot see themselves moving beyond exactly where they're at, they have no sense of hope for anything, not just the future, but even just living in general, is a huge risk factor. Exposure to domestic violence, the reason I like to always keep this in here is because when you're talking to parents, exposure to domestic violence is a risk factor for children thinking about attempting suicide or dying by suicide, but it's also a risk factor for kiddos failing out of school. And it's a risk factor in play for kids that are involved significantly in the legal system. And this is national data that's been collected for years and years, and this is one of the items that tends to rise to the top with these kiddos that we're talking about, these real vulnerable kiddos. Emerging LGBT, this population is 3 times more likely than others in their age group to think about and attempt suicide at some point in their life. So being in the LGBT community or questioning or having some thoughts about it doesn't make you at risk, but in addition to other things, 3 times more likely is a huge factor, which is why we really try and collect that as much as possible. Lack of connection. So as you may have heard from the beginning, the actual keynote is called Connection is Everything. Lack of connection, lack of identification of one person in this kid's life who they feel they can trust, this trusted adult. Oftentimes this is missing when we're looking at the kids that are coming in that are in the high risk and high imminent risk range. The reminder as well here is that the kids are not the only ones in the room for these suicide assessments. The parents are there as well. And we need to track sort of the feelings of the parents that are in there, and it ranges a lot. It ranges from disbelief and anger to embarrassment and shame. Disbelief is one that comes up a lot because I know my kid and you don't. And I don't know who you saw in this room today, but that is not the kid I see every day at home in my world. And there's nothing wrong with that feeling or that reaction, but it is something that we note because in that moment there is a question about whether they are believing the truth that's in the room at that moment, what their child is saying to them in that moment. Shame and embarrassment are more common than I wish they would be because parents that are hearing their kids say for the first time that they are having these feelings and they've never heard that before from their kid, the questions that they ask are, what did I miss? Like, I'm a good parent. I'm there for them. I provide for them. I talk to him all the time. What does it say about me as a parent that I didn't know this was happening? And that's something, again, that we hear in the room quite often. Anger is another one, but we're going to get into the brain a little bit in a second, and I like to remind my therapists and my interns who work at my agency that these parents have a brain as well, and their brain gets flooded with stress hormones just like your kids does. And they're in a room, they got called at work, they got told their kid they needed to come to the school, and then they got told their kid said something or did something about wanting to die. Then they're driving to this new agency, waiting to get assessed. I mean, even as I'm saying it, I'm feeling a little like you can see how overwhelming that would be. So a default to anger doesn't say anything about that parent necessarily, except what they're feeling in the room right now. But it's important for us to know that this is what's happening in the room with us. But the larger thing that's in play here is fear. There's so much fear around the idea that my child's safety is at risk, that it is possible that my child no longer wants to be alive and in this world, and I missed something. The fears that come from these types of things are oftentimes around fear of doing something wrong, fear of doing something that will lead them to actually end up attempting or dying or creating a worse situation. But overcoming this fear is exactly what we as parents and even educators really need to do. And one of the easiest ways, I like the idea of leaning on facts as a way to help us through the fear. And oftentimes, I think I've said oftentimes like 20 times, but oftentimes in these assessments, what we'll do is really try and normalize some things for the parents, especially parents that are really blaming themselves about what's happening in this moment. So being able to talk to them about what's happening in your child's body right now and what's happening in the body of children that age across the world and how uncontrollable some of that is. And I make a lot of assumptions about what people know, and every time it pops into my head that I'm not going to talk to this mom about puberty or what's happening in her 12-year-old son's body or a 12-year-old girl's body, I make myself say it because I know better. Because you might have some sense of what's happening, but I don't know how involved you are in the medical field in that way where you're tracking more than just, I get it, it's puberty, there's a lot going on, because there's a lot going on. But I say that fact only because there's something safe about being able to normalize for a parent the realities of what's happening. But these are still amazingly hard conversations. And these are not the only hard conversations that parents have with their kids. So individually in families, they're having hard conversations about trauma, about death of a loved one, about significant changes that are going to be happening in that family's world. For littles, having a conversation about the death of a pet is devastating, and you have to deal with that devastation with them. So there's these hard conversations that happen all the time. But in order to give it some context, I like to talk about the common hard conversations that we have to have as parents, whether we want to or not. And if you base these conversations in fact and not fear, how it can help us get through it. So talking to our kids about sexual health is one of them, right? So the idea, the myths around talking to our children about their bodies and about sexual health is that it's going to lead to an increase in sexuality, an increase in curiosity. It's going to advance them in their desire to become it all involved in anything related to sexuality earlier, just by virtue of having that conversation. They have some really amazing studies out there that really talk about how parents speak to the reality that if I do this, I will shorten their innocence, their innocent childhood, just by talking to them about these things. The facts are absolutely the opposite, and comprehensive sexual education data nationally that has just years and years and years of just this rich, rich data really does speak to the fact that if you talk to your child early and often about these things, it delays this activity. It eliminates unwanted pregnancies and the possibilities of STIs. My web designer put D's there, but it's actually infections, not diseases, so just a little aside. But it's a hard conversation. I talk to parents all day about having these hard conversations, and this is one of those that really makes people just want to shut down and turn away because I just want my 10-year-old to be a 10-year-old, and you're asking me to talk to them about this list of things. Suicide is exactly the same way. The fear of actually saying the word suicide and death out loud to our kids, there is that natural fear that they may not have been thinking about that as an option, and now I've just put it in their head. There's a lot of programs out there. One of them is called Mental Health First Aid. They have this whole section that really speaks to the fact that saying it, naming it, does not make it a reality. And the truth is that suicide is the second leading cause of death for people ages 10 to 24. The second leading cause of death, 10 to 24 years old. 80% of kids report that they have thought about suicide at some point in their lives. So talking about it isn't what's driving what's happening here. In fact, it's sort of the exact opposite. My presenter who does the mental health first aid stuff, she makes people in a room turn to each other after she has this conversation and makes you ask the other person the question, are you thinking about killing yourself, and have you ever thought about dying? And watching people do that, I do this all day, every day, and I still hate asking the direct question, because you're looking at this vulnerable person across from you and you're about to ask them this amazingly painful and vulnerable thing. But you have to ask the question. And there is a gentleman, some of you may have heard of him, his name is Kevin Hines. He actually survived a suicide attempt off the Golden Gate Bridge. He's an author, he's a presenter, he has lots of great story out there. I'm not going to speak about his whole story. But there's two things in his story that directly relate to what we're talking about here today. And the first one is, he said that after his dad dropped him off at school and he got on the bus and he's headed to the bridge, that if one person had asked him, he made an agreement with himself, if one person asks me if I'm okay, I'm going to tell them everything. Not one person asked him. And he described himself, I'm walking toward the bridge, I've got tears running down my face. One woman actually stopped him and asked him to take a picture of her on the bridge. So in thinking about asking and having those hard conversations and saying those words, here's an example, and I know it's one example, but it's a powerful example of somebody saying, if someone had done that. And his dad, he will actually put his dad on blast a little bit, because his dad knew a lot was going on and was checking in, but never really asked the question that he felt he needed to hear to be vulnerable and to say what he needed to say. The second thing that he said, which leads us into the brain conversation, is that the millisecond his hands left the rail of the Golden Gate Bridge, he instantly regretted it. And when they asked other survivors of people who jumped off the bridge, they all said the same thing, which also relates to other data, national data of people who have attempted suicide and survived, and that the majority of them report that after they did whatever lethal means they took, they regretted it. And that is so important when we're talking about adolescence, because we're talking about a brain that is in development and in flux for about 10 years. It's still growing after that, but we're talking about this adolescent period. And if I have any doctors or neuroscientists or anybody medical in here, just forgive what I'm about to do. But, there's just a simple way to do some of these things. So please don't take notes and call anybody and tell them that I don't know anything about the brain. But when you're talking about your adolescence, it's important to remember these three parts, really. The caveman brain, the emotional brain, and the thinking brain. And there's a child psychologist out there, his name is Dr. Dan Siegel, and if you've never heard of him, he's amazing. And he wrote a book especially for kids about their own brains and about their own bodies, and it's totally worth reading. But he does this brain example, and I'm going to do it for you, where if you think about this as your spinal column, and you think about this as your brain stem, your thumb becomes your emotional brain, and all of this becomes your thinking brain. So this is something you can teach to kids, especially if they don't have language for what's happening to them. But this is a model of what that is. So when we're talking about the adolescent brain, and we're talking about impulsivity, and we're talking about bodies flooding with stress hormones, given everything else that they're dealing with, right? Like the social anxieties, developing relationships, their bodies not working the way they used to, this is a good example for what's happening when we're talking about the kids that we're talking about, because this would be a kid who something happens at school that really triggers them, and they come home and they're spinning and spinning and spinning on what happened, right? So they're like this for the most part, then that thing happens and this flies off. It completely disengages from the rest of it. And again, simplistic description. But the reality is the thinking brain is no longer engaged for these kids. So they're really stressed out, their bodies flood with these stress hormones, their thinking brain flies off, and they're working on the caveman brain. They're working on the emotional brain. It's all about fight, flight, freeze, faint. And if you have an idea of a kiddo who might be up in his room, really distressed, spinning on whatever thought he's spinning and spinning and spinning on, and nothing's going to get better, and I don't know what to do, my thinking brain isn't engaged, and I'm thinking about wanting to die, and that impulsivity hits, then I'm going to potentially grab or do whatever it is that lethal gesture is. So it could be jumping out the window, grabbing a knife, grabbing a razor, whatever that lethal mean is in that moment. And the reason this is important for parents to think about is because the idea really is, how can we get this to come back down? And does everybody have a Charlie Brown reference in this room? Because I say this to kids now and I get just deadpan when I say this. But the truth is, when your kid is in this stage and you're trying to talk to them, they are hearing the equivalent of the Charlie Brown teacher. They are just hearing you talking at them. They are not, even if they wanted to, really able to grasp what you're trying to grasp for them. And a couple suggestions that we have, because again, if you have a kiddo who isn't in a suicidal place or a self-harming place, they're just really dysregulated, you can be in that space with them and help them ground. You can help them think about things, distract them a little bit. When we're dealing with safety stuff, we sometimes often will say, because I love milkshakes, so I will tell parents oftentimes, take your kid on a walk, put them in the car, go get them a milkshake. The reality is, what we're talking about is putting them in a car with the window down and the radio on and the trees whizzing by them, so they're looking at something different. They've got wind blowing at their face. The radio is playing some music. Mom is trying to sing the song, which is really annoying. So as much as I want to stay stuck in this place, I'm almost not able to. So slowly during this time, my brain can start to come back down, and I can start to begin to think about what almost became a real impulsive decision. And impulsive is definitely the word here when you think about those suicide attempt survivors who said, the millisecond I did what I did, I regretted it. Because it's that lack of control, that impulsivity, our higher functioning not engaged, and us doing that thing and regretting it. So when it comes to parents, and again, the car analogy, it's just a small description of it. I used to use the description of, back in the day, they used to tell you when you wanted to stop smoking, to put a rubber band around your wrist, and every time you thought about a cigarette, to snap the rubber band, which actually they say doesn't really work. But the reality behind it, the reasoning behind it, kind of works when we're talking about what we're talking about. Because I'm stuck and I'm spinning, and now I have this pain down here that my brain is acknowledging, and I'm acknowledging it. I'm trying to come back and be spinning and spinning, but then this still hurts. So the concept behind it is sort of what we're asking parents to think about. Because at the end of the day, what we're looking for is for you to see that everything that just happened, every behavior that your child had in that moment is trying to tell you something. And I had a colleague use a great example, because they said sometimes it's like your kid is playing charades and you have to figure out what it is they're actually trying to say to you. So if you think about every behavior is trying to communicate something to you, you need to look at those behaviors and be that point of connection for them for when their brain settles down. And just in a second we'll talk about what that will look like. But Dr. Bruce Perry is another neurobiologist who works with adolescents significantly, another brilliant guy. And the fact that he says that the most effective intervention for neurobiological, for your brain and your body, the best intervention for your brain and your body is a safe relationship. The whole idea of everything that we're talking about leads to that place of being a safe relationship. And I will tell parents this, that it's not always able to be you And sometimes that needs to be okay. We sometimes can't be exactly what our kids need for us, but if I know that I can't be the safe connection that you need, the connection that you need, then I can help you find it. Let me help you find that person, whether it's an uncle or a grandpa or a neighbor or a coach or whatever it is. So it's important for parents to not constantly feel like they're being asked to do something that they just don't have the time or the capacity to do, even though they would drop everything to do it. Because usually it's not just that one kid that's relying on them for their survival, for their food, for the roof over their head. So finding them that connection, and once you have that connection, once this is back down, once this thinking brain is back in place, it's hard to not want to talk to our kids in this space. And the challenge here is actually listening versus talking. And my boss likes to use examples of, usually when kids come out of these spaces, they begin talking about things about negative things. This is your fault, or something about parenting, or something about the life that they lead. And our instinct is to protect ourselves and to even defend some of that. The task here, the trick here, is to remain curious and inquiring and not be defensive. Because the truth is, our kids don't talk to us as much as we want them to. We're like the primary person in their life until we're not. And, my kid is 24, and now we're pretty close. But there was a minute there where, as much as I tried, I couldn't tell you as much about him as I really wanted to. So in those moments, if you can keep quiet, if you could just listen, if you can engage them in conversations, just by virtue of the fact that they're talking to you, you are likely to learn things about them that you never would have learned. They're coming off of a crisis. Their thinking brain is engaged. They're having some thoughts. Let them say whatever it is they need to say to you, and just hold that space. And my husband yelled at me today because he said, nobody knows what holding space means, just therapists. Like, you're going to say that and you're going to get deadpan looks. And I think that's ridiculous, because the visual of holding space for our children in those moments is literally holding a safe area where they can be and say anything they want, and we're going to believe them. In that room, when we're doing those suicide assessments, our ask of these parents is, that may not be the kid that you live with every single day, but believe him right now that he's telling you where he is at right now. Love him enough to believe that right now this is what he's feeling, and holding that space for him to do that. If he's in trouble, you can always consequence later. And that's always a reminder I give to parents, is that consequences don't have to happen right away. Love them, hold them safe, keep them safe, and once safety is no longer an issue, then you can ground him for whatever he did before then. There's this idea that this is such a rough, terrible time for adolescents, right? But the reality is, there's like this 0 to 10 that I was talking about, where they're really dependent on us. They basically are 100% dependent and then mostly dependent. And that's this blip of time. And then there's this next blip of time, which is about 10 to 19, that adolescent period, where they're autonomous, they're out there figuring out how to be in relationships, how to be in relation to the world, learning things, pain, the whole nine, and their bodies are working against them. That's this period as well. And then there's this 80 years at the back end of that. And we will sit with kids oftentimes and try to get them to think about the next 80 years. And in preparation for this keynote, I went and looked at a YouTube of Dan Siegel just to fact check myself. What am I missing? Did something change? Make sure I didn't come up here and tell you guys stuff that wasn't true. And he totally said the exact opposite of what I just told you. So he said, it's oftentimes an instinct to help kids survive adolescence, because it's rough because of all the things that we went through, but in fact it's our challenge as parents to help them thrive in it, to help them experience all these wonderful things. And that's true. But then I remembered the population that we're talking about, and frankly, at the end of the day, sometimes kids just need that help to survive it, and that's okay. We need to be okay with that. Some kids are living in situations that are not ideal or dealing with things that they can't really handle. And if we can get them to think about themselves not in this space, but past this space, into this next 80 years, that's hope, and that's hopeful. And that's what our goal is, to help get them to that place of hopefulness. And I usually use an image that is a person helping another person out of a hole. And the hole analogy I love, because whether they dug the hole themselves or somebody pushed them in it, whatever, the hole analogy is this narrow view of the entire world when you're looking up from the bottom of a hole. You can't see the entire perspective. And I switched it to this image because oftentimes we're just looking for them to see the light, just that they can see a glimpse of a possibility of something better. And that's our challenge as parents, and a challenge that we have every day in our suicide assessments. So thank you so much for listening. I'm going to be out there if anybody has any questions or would like to talk about any of this, but I really appreciate you guys coming out and spending the time to just be part of this wellness fair. So thank you.